My name is Eliseo Hinojos. We are the North Texas Church of Christ. We are physically located at 1290 FM 407 in North Lake, Texas. My email is minister, all lowercase, minister at ntxcoc.com. And I give you that email so you can email me with any notes or questions or suggestions that you might have. Our physical Bible classes begin at 9:30 a.m. and our worship services begin at 10:30 a.m. From now on, we are, like I mentioned last week, we are pre-recording our Bible classes. So this is actually our Sunday morning Bible class. So if you are not able to be with us physically, just sit and watch and go through the scriptures with us, and you can enjoy a Bible study just like anyone else. But we do invite you that if you are able to come and visit us physically, please do that. I invite you this morning to pause for a minute and read again the book of James. This is where we are taking our Sunday morning class from. I invite you to, again, to just read this letter every week before you even watch the video. And if you haven't had a chance to do it, just go ahead and pause and do that. And as you're going to read this letter, you're going to realize that James attacks a whole, it seems like a myriad of subjects. And it seems that they're unconnected at times. James seems to be jumping from one subject to the next. But I don't think that that's what James is doing. What he's doing is, because this is a general letter that is meant to be read by a whole lot of different people from different walks of life, from different situations, I think that he's writing this letter to kind of, not dedicate it, but to kind of apply it to a lot of different Christians in a lot of different situations. And he's trying to deal with a whole lot of different things that affect all of us at one time or another. Because as you read through this letter, you're gonna see yourself reflected in it quite a lot. All of the subjects that he deals with, that he talks about, are common to the human condition, or more rather to the point, common to the Christian condition. Last time, we looked at the greeting, at just James chapter 1 and verse 1. And we looked at the concept of being a slave to Christ. Let's continue this morning. Read with me James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. James says, "My brothers, consider it all joy when you fall into various temptations, knowing that the trying of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its complete work, that you may be complete and entire, lacking in nothing." I want you to think about a couple of things. I want you to think about, just for a moment, what are some things that make you happy? Like if you were to imagine something, maybe a memory, maybe a person in your life, maybe a situation, maybe something that has happened to you. What are some things that bring you happiness? I can think of a few things, right? My wife, my children, some good things that have happened in my life, some good things that are happening in my life right now that really bring me peace and bring me joy. And I find curious, right, that James doesn't put any of those things in this list when it comes to causing joy in our lives. And I wonder, why aren't those things on this short list for joy? Is it maybe because when James says joy, he doesn't mean happy like we mean it. He doesn't mean like smiling and giddy and having a party and then, that kind of joy. The kind of joy that James is talking about is the kind of joy that brings not only peace, but maybe relief. If you keep this in context, and you look at everything that James is talking about, the concept of joy here is more of a feeling a place in our spiritual life in which you are in agreement with God's authority. Now I'm going to say that again because I want you to hear what that I want you to hear what that says. And I want you to hear me when I say that. And I want you to pause and just meditate on what that means. When James says that you are to have joy in your life, what he means is that you are in a place in your life spiritually that you are in agreement with God's authority. Now, put that in the concept of what we talked about last week of being a slave, right? Because our will is not our own, our will is God's will. And so, in agreement with that, in continuation of that, not only are we in God's will, not only are we making God's will our own, but we are in agreement with everything that God has authorized for our own life and for the world. That's what joy is. It's not only a sense of peace, a sense of tranquility, but it is a sense of being in agreement with God. So how are we supposed to be at peace? How are we supposed to have relief when we're falling into various temptations? Someone once told me a long time ago that if you are not knocking heads with evil, it's probably because you're going in the same direction. Someone else told me that the spirit inside of us is that little voice that is telling you what to do and what not to do. And so they told me, listen to that little voice in your head. Right? That's what testing and tribulations, and that's what temptations kind of, that's the road that we start going down when we're trying to understand what the difference is between the testing, between the tribulation, and between all these difficult things that we go through, and the relationship that has with peace and joy in our life. Right? So the next concept to deal with in these couple of verses is, what is a temptation? What is a trial? What is a tribulation? Because I think Christians often confuse the two things. We're often confused, but I got to tell you, they're different. I want you to look at a couple of scriptures with me. Okay, just a little bit farther down in James chapter 1 and verse 13. James, continuing the idea here of temptations and trials, he says in verse 13, he says, "Let no one who is tempted say, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one." Now I want you to go all the way back to the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1, we're told, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him. Okay? Now, you want to keep reading that story, you can. But that's the phrase that I wanted to focus on. Psalm chapter 66 and verse 10 says, "For you, O God, have tested us. You have tried us as silver is tried." Now, John chapter 6 and verse 6 says, "He said this," talking about Jesus, "to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." So as we can see, and those just are few of the scriptures. You can go into concordance, or you can go even on Google and Google a whole lot more scriptures on the differences between temptation and testing. Right? So you can see that God doesn't do the tempting, but he does do the testing. We can see evidence by these scriptures that temptation and testing are not the same. And I want to make that very clear, because sometimes we as Christians, we confuse the two. Testing is of godly origin, because God tests our faith. So if the testing of our faith comes from God, what does it mean when James says when you encounter temptations? Well, obviously we can deduce then that temptations are not from God. And temptations have a different origin. The opposite of God, of course, is evil. And remember, God does not tempt anyone. So where do temptations come from? Of course, temptations are the things that the devil, that Satan, that the darkness tries and use to lure us away from God. And temptations can take so many different forms. Pretty much anything that lures us away from God can be a temptation. And those things can be physical, they can be psychological, they can be emotional, and they can be, most of all, spiritual. But it's anything that is out there that God, that not God, excuse me, but that the devil puts in our path to take us away from God. As we live our lives for God, there are going to be temptations. So if we are not being tempted, I want you to hear me carefully. If you are not being tempted, maybe it's because your life is not really hurting the kingdom of darkness. Maybe it's because you're not really going against the darkness in your own life. You see, the evil one doesn't worry about people who are already under his control. If you are being tempted, that means that the devil considers you a threat. And he wants to tear you down. And he wants to tear you away from God. So how are we supposed to be protected from that? Well, we're going to look at that a little bit later in this letter, because James gives us a solution to that, how to protect ourselves or how to be protected. So when the temptation comes into our life, the test is, what are we going to do about that temptation? So the temptation is whatever it is that is trying to lure us away from God, and the test of our faith is the decision that we make when we encounter that temptation. Our faith is tested every time we encounter a temptation and we make a decision toward it. We either fall or we don't, according to whatever we decide at the time we encounter those temptations. James, in the verses that we read, says, when you fall. And of course, that's indicating that we will fall. And I think I think all of us can echo that sentiment and agree that we do fall. We fall over and over in our lives. We say things that are not supposed to be in our lives, that they're not meant to be in the life of a Christian. And when we do that, and when we fall into temptation, when we start falling away from God, what do we do then? What do we do? What decision do we make? Do we stay and wallow in it? Do we stay and throw ourselves a pity party? Do we feel guilty about it? Do we start looking for a solution? Or do we feel embarrassed and we try and hide it? You guys remember the creation story? You remember when Adam and Eve made the big mistake that they made? Eve took that fruit from the tree and gave to Adam, and they made the mistake, and they knew they weren't supposed to do that, but they did anyway. And then later on in the story, if you go back and read Genesis chapter 2 and 3, you'll see that there was one day that God was looking for them, like God didn't know where they were, right? But he's going out in the garden, and he's looking for Adam, and he says, Adam, Adam, where are you? And Adam says, I was hiding because I heard you in the garden and I knew I was naked. And most of you know the story, and if you don't, I invite you to go back and read Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. But this is what Adam and Eve did. When they knew they did something wrong, first they tried to hide it. Then they tried to justify it. Then they tried to blame each other. Folks, and that's the same thing that we do today. Is that the decision that we need to be making when we fall into temptation? When we fall into something that we know is going to pull us away from God? Well, that decision, folks, that's the test. And when we pass the test, when we make a good decision and we decide to open ourselves to God and say, Lord, I messed up. Forgive me. That's when our faith grows. That's when the testing of our faith, according to James, produces endurance. Because let me tell you that you don't know how strong your faith is until it starts being tested. Until it starts being tested, we don't know what we're made of. The testing of our faith produces endurance, and endurance means simply that you get more stamina. You get enduring stamina. And as we mature and as we grow, as we deepen our relationship with God, the temptations, let me tell you, are going to become stronger. Yeah, they don't get easier. I wish I could tell you that there's going to be a time in your Christian life, in your relationship with God, where you're not going to be tempted anymore. And you're not going to be tested anymore. Let me tell you, that's not going to happen. Because as you grow, as you mature, right, as your faith gets stronger, the temptations are also going to get more difficult. They are. But let me tell you that if we keep submitting to God, we're going to keep growing. We are. So I ask myself a question at this point. I say, what does it say about my relationship with God if I'm being tempted today by the same things that I've been tempted in the past? You know what that means? It means that I haven't grown. It means that I'm still in the same place. That's right. If today you're being tempted by the same things that you were tempted 5 years ago, it means that your faith hasn't grown very much. It means that our faith is constantly being tested and we're constantly failing. How do we pass that test? Folks, by making the right decision. By becoming more patient and receiving that endurance that only comes from God. And the scripture continues to say, as we grow in patience, we have peace. And then James says, we lack in nothing. Now, again, you have to keep these things in context. And what James isn't saying is that he is not saying that you will reach a point at some time in your life that you will not need anything. That's not what he's saying. This idea of literally lacking nothing, what he's saying is that there's going to be a time in your life where you're going to know exactly what to do when you're faced with a temptation. And that is submit to God. Make the right choice. The idea here is not lacking nothing. No, it's being ready to confront more temptations. It's being ready for more. That's the idea. Being in a place spiritually that you are ready for whatever comes. Because your faith will grow no matter what tests come. No matter what temptations you are faced with, you're ready for them. Because you know that your reaction, you know that our reaction should be to follow God and to follow Him no matter what comes our way. Thank you for joining us today. Again, I would like to invite you to physically come to our Sunday morning services. Our Bible classes start at 9:30 a.m. Our worship begins at 10:30 a.m. So again, thank you for tuning in, and God bless you.